Hey everyone, how's it going? Matthew Kadish here, author, evil genius, and professional Mr. Fancy Pants. And today we're going to be talking about Kathleen Kennedy, the inner workings of Hollywood, and why everyone got things so wrong about Kathleen Kennedy being fired from Lucasfilm. Alright guys, so this is going to be something new for me. I'm not used to doing these kind of off-the-cuff videos. I'm actually not very good just speaking from my brain. So I usually like to go off scripted stuff, but this one I'm just going to wing it, see how it goes. And if you guys like the video, be sure to let me know. Maybe I'll make more of them. I don't know, it depends on my schedule and how often I can take time to film and edit video as opposed to doing what I should be doing right now, which is working on my novels. Anyway, for those of you who aren't aware, there was some controversy the past couple of weeks where I publicly came out and basically expressed my opinion that I didn't believe Kathleen Kennedy was going to be fired, and I felt like a lot of the people who were reporting on the fact that she was going to be fired were mistaken or just flat out wrong. And this kind of blew up on Twitter, where a lot of people who had inside information, inside sources, and were very confident in Kathleen Kennedy ultimately being fired from Lucasfilm basically spoke up, came out against me, and in some cases even personally attacked me. But, you know, it wasn't a big deal. It was just kind of like a friendly back and forth disagreement over the current state of Lucasfilm Limited. And for those of you who don't know, I have a background in Hollywood. I worked in the industry for a number of years. I've been wanting to make movies and tell stories my entire life since I was like 12 years old. And I'd gone to film school, I'd gone to numerous film festivals. I had a movie in the Cannes Film Festival in 2004 out in France. And, got a lot of attention from it, got to deal with studio executives and producers, and really got a first-hand look at how things worked in the movie industry. And so when I was seeing a lot of these news stories come out about how Kathleen Kennedy's out the door and she's going to be fired, it just didn't ring true to me because I know how the studio system works, and I have experience in seeing a lot of these like kind of background, behind-the-scenes dramas play out among studio executives. When I lived in LA, I lived in West Hollywood for like 10 years, and I'd follow Variety and The Hollywood Reporter pretty religiously because I was always fascinated by the business behind Hollywood. And a lot of my neighbors worked in the industry. I had, people who were managers of famous actors and, agents and stuff like that living in my building, and I would talk to them from time to time. And, just living in the center of the entertainment industry, you hear things. But I also worked at Paramount Studios for a time, and I learned how, the studio rumor mill operates there, and, various other things. But the long and short of it is, my opinion was that Kathleen Kennedy was not going to be fired. She's going to stay exactly where she was, and she's probably going to stay there for another 10 years, or at least until she feels the need to step down. And a lot of people disagreed with me, and that's perfectly fine. That's their decision. But a few days ago, the story was reported that Kathleen Kennedy's contract had been renewed for another 3 years. So ultimately, I was proven right, and the people who were arguing against me were proven wrong. And that's not to say that, I'm trying to brag or demean those people, because, we're all on the same side. None of us really like the fact that of, Kathleen Kennedy being in charge of Lucasfilm, because we don't agree with how she's been handling the franchise. And we're all big lovers of Star Wars. We just have a difference of opinion over how reality actually works. And from my experience in Hollywood, this was right in line with what I feared was going to happen. Whereas a lot of other people, I think that their sources that, I don't doubt that they had inside sources telling them what was going to happen. I doubted the validity of what those sources were reporting. And I think what it came down to was that a lot of these inside sources that were leaking information knew that Kathleen Kennedy's contract was coming to an end in September. And that's why you heard a lot of rumors about Kathleen Kennedy being out in September, because all these people were of the same mindset that a lot of us in the fandom are, that Kathleen Kennedy has done irreparable damage to the Star Wars brand, and that she's costing Disney money, and there's all these negatives in her corner that made people believe, oh, hey, there's no way Disney will renew her contract and keep her on board. Because there's just all this evidence to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she's not very good at what she does. Now, I agree that Kathleen Kennedy is not the right person to be running Star Wars, but I disagree with a lot of these points that people have been making. And so I'm going to kind of go through this, and hopefully I make sense because I'm just going off the top of my head here. And then we'll get into a few more specific details about certain things. So first of all, I just want to say that I don't think Kathleen Kennedy is a bad producer. Now, before you guys click off this video and start cursing me out for saying such a sacrilegious thing, I just want to point out that Kathleen Kennedy has been making movies for decades. She's been producing movies for decades. And she's actually been involved in a number of movies that are arguably classics. I love the Indiana Jones film. She was involved heavily with every single Indiana Jones film that was ever made, including the first one. So, pretty much every Steven Spielberg movie ever made, she was involved in. So, to say that she's a bad producer is not technically accurate. Her strength as a producer is that she's very good at logistics, and she's very good at making sure that the director that she's working with has everything that that director needs to realize their vision. If I was still directing movies, Kathleen Kennedy is the type of producer I would want to be working with me, because she's very good at just giving the director whatever they need and whatever they want so that they can focus clearly and solidly on being the creative driving force behind the movie, as opposed to dealing with all the unfun stuff of making movies, like locations and permits and budgeting and all that other stuff. So from what I've seen of Kathleen Kennedy's track record, she's a very good producer, and that's why she has so many really powerful friends in Hollywood, really powerful allies, really powerful people that she has a working relationship with. Now, that being said, I think that Kathleen Kennedy has proven that she's not a very good creative producer. And creative producers are kind of like the people who will come in and they're kind of like the executive producers in TV, where they oversee an entire season's worth of a show, and they kind of make the big creative decisions for the show, and everyone else is just kind of like an underling beneath them that's carrying out their will. And I think that a lot of people were expecting Kathleen Kennedy to kind of be more like Kevin Feige over at Marvel, in the sense that she'd kind of take control of the overarching plot threads, the overarching stories that Star Wars would be exploring, and she'd have a lot more control over how those stories are told. But that's not how she's used to working. If you look at her track record, she's used to basically allowing the creatives to do whatever it is they want, and she's just there to facilitate that they get what they want. And that's always been her job, and she's kind of doing that same thing in Lucasfilm, and it's not working. And the reason it's not working is because a franchise like Star Wars, if you're overseeing it, you have to look at it holistically. You can't just let one director go off in one direction with one movie, and then the next movie have a new director go off in a completely different direction. There needs to be some type of cohesion, and there needs to be some type of overarching oversight. That's the word, oversight, to the franchise as a whole. And Kathleen Kennedy thus far has proven that she's not very good at the whole oversight thing. She's good at spotting talent, and she's good at hiring that talent and giving that talent what they want. But when it comes down to it, that talent doesn't have the right guidance to do what, her and probably her superiors at Disney want from these movies. And it's certainly not what the fans want. If you look at the situation with Solo and Lord and Miller, that's a perfect example where, she hired these two really talented guys. She gave them everything they needed to make the type of movie they want. And she quickly found out that their creative vision was not in tune with what she felt the franchise needed. And Lord and Miller butted heads not only with her, but with Lawrence Kasdan as well, who is also a producer as well as, the co-writer of the movie. And so eventually she had to bite the bullet and fire these guys because, she had given them too much freedom to do what they wanted, and it didn't line up. And so I think that this is part of Kathleen Kennedy's growing pains, in the sense that she's having to produce movies in a way that's different from what she's been doing for decades now, and she's still kind of trying to figure out the right way to do it. Now, that's not an excuse for the bad movies that, or the bad mistakes that she's made with the franchise thus far. But that's one of the reasons why I say she's a good producer, is because when it comes to getting the movies made, she's a dream to work with for the people who, run these movies, like the directors and the writers and stuff like that. But when it comes to having a cohesive vision and overseeing all these movies, she's still kind of, I think, finding her footing. And another thing is that she's kind of abused her position as a creative producer, in the sense that she's no doubt worked in some political messaging that, you know, not all fans might agree with. And, you know, that's neither here nor there, but it does detract from the enjoyment of these movies to a great deal of the fan base, because up until she took over, Star Wars was always a very apolitical, basic morality tale where you could pretty much read whatever you wanted into the politics of the movies, but the movies never explicitly took a side. They were just kind of like, here's good, here's evil, and that's that. Even in the prequels, when, you know, galactic politics took an even more prominent stage, it was never preachy. It was always like, well, freedom and democracy is good, tyranny is bad. And that was the extent of George Lucas's message about the politics of Star Wars. But under Kathleen Kennedy's rule, you've seen a much more shift in the preaching of these movies' messaging to the left of the political spectrum. And I think that's alienated a lot of people. And I don't necessarily think that diversity or, you know, political messaging in movies is bad. I just feel that when you have a franchise that has a 30-year history of not having that stuff in there, and all of a sudden you're injecting it in, you're going to upset a lot of people. And of course she did. And I think this is another misstep on her part, as, you know, the growing pains of being a new producer for such a mega franchise. So I just want to start this off by saying, like, I don't dislike Kathleen Kennedy as a producer, but I strongly disagree with a lot of the decisions she's made regarding Star Wars, and the biggest of which was the hiring of Rian Johnson, giving him so much creative control, and further hiring him to make more Star Wars movies, because I don't feel this guy should be anywhere near Star Wars going forward. Just because he's proven that, even though, like, I think Rian Johnson's a talented filmmaker, because I've liked his other movies, and I don't think he's a terrible writer. The Last Jedi was awful, and it's clear to me that Rian Johnson doesn't have the sensibilities to be a Star Wars filmmaker. Like, he's just not in tune with what Star Wars is supposed to be. You know, any movie he makes is going to be a Rian Johnson movie. It's not going to be a Star Wars movie. And when it comes to managing these franchise pictures, you have to kind of do what Marvel does, which is bring in filmmakers that aren't very creative, who don't have a whole lot of distinctive styles or whatever, and make sure that it's run more like a TV show where, you know, the directors are basically just there to do a job, and all the creative work is done at the higher producing level. And I think that's one of the reasons why Marvel Studios has been so successful. I mean, if you look at some of the talent they've worked with, you know, Joss Whedon, all these other guys, these are arguably auteurs, people who, you know, have a very strong creative voice. And Marvel has constantly stepped on that voice because they've told them, hey, you need to, you know, get with our program. Edgar Wright was another example of this when he was going to do Ant-Man. You know, he wanted to, you know, have his own say in how this goes, and Marvel had to get rid of him because his vision wasn't lining up with theirs. But then you have the opposite, the flip side of that coin, which is James Gunn, who was incredibly unique and a very original voice within the Marvel universe. But he played ball. He worked with the Marvel studio heads, and, you know, and so he was able to work within those confines. So it is possible to, you know, be a creative filmmaker and still make, you know, these franchise movies, but the people who have total creative control and demand that type of control should be kept far away from these. I mean, if you look at any mega franchise like James Bond, they don't typically hire people like Martin Scorsese or Steven Spielberg to direct these movies, because James Bond is a very formulaic franchise, and they don't want people coming in and putting their own spin on stuff. The producers want to keep a very tight control over how that franchise is handled. And I think the same has to be true of Star Wars at a certain point, where all these other filmmakers that come in and make these movies, they have to be subservient to some type of overarching creative producer who has their finger on exactly what Star Wars should be and needs to be. And I don't think that's Kathleen Kennedy. So let's talk about Kathleen Kennedy getting rehired. And this might be a touchy subject for some people because I know a lot of people are passionate about wanting to see her gone. And I was hoping I was wrong. I was hoping that through some miracle, Hollywood had changed, and I wasn't aware of it. And she'd be let go and a more qualified person put in her place. But there's a lot of reasons why this happened, and I don't think a lot of people are telling the whole story when it comes to the reason why her contract got renewed. So the first thing that we got to talk about when it comes to Kathleen Kennedy being rehired to head up Lucasfilm is this notion that she's cost Disney money. And looking at it from the outside as someone who's not well versed in how the movie industry works, this argument might hold water, because you can look and say like, oh, The Last Jedi underperformed at the box office. It had a huge second week drop in theater attendance. Solo bombed. Toy sales are down. Yada yada yada. Blah blah blah. And this is all true. Like the stuff happened, and I do think that we've seen a downturn in the profitability of Star Wars. It wasn't the juggernaut that it once was when The Force Awakens first came out. However, Kathleen Kennedy has not lost Disney any money. And I know that might not compute with some of you, but you have to look at it from a Hollywood studio point of view in order to have this make sense. And a lot of people don't think this way. They like to think in terms of common sense, whereas Hollywood studios, they're not governed by common sense oftentimes. In fact, the entire industry of Hollywood is run by left-leaning SJWs pretty much, and we all know that logic doesn't tend to factor into those people's decision making. So you have to look at this from a totally different perspective than what you think might actually be real. And so what I mean by this is, first of all, you can't use toy sales or merchandise sales or anything like that as a argument against Kathleen Kennedy. And the reason for that is because all those things fall under licensing deals. And the licensing for Disney is an entirely separate branch of the company. It's called Disney Consumer Products, and they're the division of Disney which is responsible for all these licenses for like t-shirts, hats. They even have fragrance lines and hotel card keys and keychains and frisbees, pretty much anything that has Star Wars or Marvel or Pixar or Disney stuff on it. It's licensed out through Disney Consumer Products. And so Disney Consumer Products, the umbrella for that falls under, covers toys, it covers books, comic books, audiobooks, pretty much anything that is licensed out to another company to be used. So when you're talking about a downturn in the sales of Star Wars toys or Star Wars merchandise in general, that's not on the Lucasfilm Limited balance sheet. That's on the Disney Consumer Products balance sheet. So those losses aren't reflected to be directly attributable to the branch of Disney that Kathleen Kennedy directly runs. And in addition to that, if there is a downturn in Star Wars merchandising revenues, those are usually made up by other, divisions of Disney. So for instance, last year, Star Wars stuff underperformed in terms of sales, but Marvel stuff overperformed. They had a banner year with Marvel, what with Black Panther and now Avengers Infinity War and all this other stuff. And in addition to that, Frozen, Disney's Frozen, Wreck-It Ralph, The Incredibles 2, all these other big Disney properties did very well. And so when those things overperform, the underperformance of Star Wars kind of gets lost in the shuffle of that. And even though the people who run Disney Consumer Products might look at their books and be like, well, Star Wars didn't do as well as we would have liked, people at Bob Iger's level, like the top Disney executives, when they look at the balance sheet, they don't look at the specifics of which product made money. They just look at the balance sheet, the profit and loss statements from the Consumer Products division. And as long as there's profit there, they're like, hey, everything's fine. So this argument that toy sales and all that other stuff are costing Disney money and they're attributable to Kathleen Kennedy, just it's not a good argument. Okay, and another thing is that Disney Consumer Products has almost no overhead. Okay, like their profit liabilities are the payment of their employees, and that's pretty much it. Okay, payment for lawyers to draw up these licensing agreements, whatever the case may be, because Disney Consumer Products doesn't actually manufacture anything. All these t-shirts, hats, keychains, books, things like that, Disney doesn't make those. They don't have divisions within Disney that actually produce these things. What they do is they license out the rights to companies that already make this stuff and, just collect a paycheck off of that. So let's take the Star Wars toys, for example. Hasbro has the exclusive worldwide rights to Star Wars toys, and they were able to get that by buying out the previous license holder, Kenner, and absorbing them into the company. Now, under the license deal with Disney, Hasbro has to pay an upfront fee to use the license, and I believe it's something like $250 million. So right off the bat, Disney got $250 million in pure profit off of the toy license for Star Wars. Now, in addition to that, Disney makes a 20% royalty off of every Star Wars toy sold. So for every dollar of sales that a toy generates, Disney gets 20% or 20 cents. Okay, which is a huge royalty. I mean, royalties are usually around 10%, but Disney, because Star Wars is such a juggernaut, they were able to get Hasbro to agree to 20% royalty. And in addition to that 20% royalty, there's a minimum sales figure that Hasbro has to meet, which means that Disney is guaranteed to make a certain amount of money off of royalties every year. Okay, and if Hasbro fails to meet that minimum sales level, they're still on the hook for that money. And because Disney isn't manufacturing these toys, Hasbro is the one that's putting out all the expenditure. So all toy sales are pure profit for Disney. Okay, it doesn't matter if they underperform. It just means they're making less profit as opposed to a ton of profit. So anything that the toys do in Disney's eyes is a moneymaker. So this argument that there's a downward turn in toy sales and that's costing Disney money isn't true, because chances are they've already made close to $1 billion just off of licensing alone, and there's no overhead for that licensing. It's pure profit. Disney is not putting out any money to produce these things and put them out into stores and stuff like that. And I'll probably go into detail in toy licensing stuff in a different video or a different article, because if you want to get really wonky and into the weeds, I can do that for you and really explain in detail how it works out. But just know that anyone who cites sales figures of toys or merchandise as proof that Disney's losing money does not know how Disney's licensing business works. And they're probably mistaken because Disney makes pure profit off of this stuff. So even if there's a downward turn in sales, Disney's still making a profit. So that in and of itself is not enough to fire Kathleen Kennedy, because she has nothing to do with that division of Disney. If there was a loss, that would be addressed by taking a look at the executives running the consumer products division, not Lucasfilm. Now, that being said, the movies do have an impact on how valuable the licensing is, but regardless, that's not under the umbrella by which Kathleen Kennedy is judged by Disney executives. Okay. Now, in addition to that, home video is a different department entirely as well. Disney has its own home video division, which is responsible for putting out stuff on DVD, Blu-ray, VHS, if there's still VHS releases or whatever, streaming, all that other stuff. And they also sell the syndication rights to TV and foreign territories and all that other stuff. So that's an entirely separate division as well. So if there's a downturn on DVD sales, that means that Kathleen Kennedy's not on the hook for that either, because that's a whole other separate division, just like Disney Consumer Products is. So the only metric by which Kathleen Kennedy is actually judged by her superiors at Disney are how well the movies perform, and probably how well the TV shows are going to perform. But then again, the TV shows are kind of a different business model, because number one, the Star Wars TV show that they're developing right now with Jon Favreau is being made specifically for Disney's new streaming service, and all the other TV shows, the cartoons and stuff like that, are judged based off of advertising revenue, selling commercial ads during their runs, and syndication revenue. So that type of thing, it's going to be really hard to attribute anything from that other than success to Kathleen Kennedy, because it's a different metric by which they're judging the success of those TV properties. So the only thing that people can really point to in terms of Kathleen Kennedy's performance are the films. Okay, and so far we've had 4 Star Wars films, right? We've had The Force Awakens, we've had Rogue One, The Last Jedi, and Solo: A Star Wars Story. Now, as much as we dislike The Last Jedi, and as much as some people might not care about Solo, the fact is that all 4 of these movies are attributed to Kathleen Kennedy, and 3 of them have been financially successful. The only one that underperformed at the box office was Solo: A Star Wars Story. And there's a lot of ways to spin that failure that we'll talk about in a little bit. But The Force Awakens made a ton of money at the box office. Rogue One made a ton of money. And The Last Jedi, even though it was bad, made a ton of money. So that's 3 wins in Kathleen Kennedy's corner so far. Now, the only misstep in that was Solo, and there were a couple of extenuating circumstances to why that movie faltered, but that's the only thing that is directly attributable to her, to say, like, look, she messed this up. So that's the only black eye that Disney can really look at and say Kathleen Kennedy owns that. But that being said, the reason studio executives become entrenched in their positions is because they get very good at spinning the facts and dumping failures off on other people or other factors. And already, from Bob Iger's interview in The Hollywood Reporter a few weeks ago, we see how Disney is looking at the failure of Solo. And even though I'm sure they blame Kathleen Kennedy for the production problems and having to spend so much money on reshoots, basically reshooting the whole movie, they don't see the failure at the box office as entirely her fault. I think it's obvious that Disney believes that there's franchise fatigue among audiences with the Star Wars saga, which they're attributing to Solo's underperformance. They're also attributing it to a enhanced release, or a pushed up release date. So instead of the normal Christmas time release for Star Wars, it was in summer in a very competitive movie season, and it just kind of got lost in the shuffle. So that's the second thing that they're attributing Solo's poor performance to. And I'm sure there's a couple other things that we could cite as the reason why Solo underperformed at the box office. And I guarantee you Kathleen Kennedy has cited all those to Disney's higher-ups as to why Solo underperformed. So one flop is not enough to sink a studio executive. Because in the movie business, everyone has flops. It's a part of the business. And you have to understand that a lot of these people, they may be fans of certain movies, but they're not very creative people at the top of these studios. They're business people. So even though Bob Iger can come out and say, I'm a Star Wars fan, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's a fan like we're a fan. He could look at The Last Jedi and be like, yeah, I liked it, So there's any number of reasons why Kathleen Kennedy wouldn't be held accountable by the higher-ups at Disney for her serious mishandling of the franchise so far. And even if they were trying to hold her accountable, she could just say hey, it wasn't my call, it was Rian Johnson's call, or Ron Howard's call, or whoever, because she gave these creative people all the support they needed. They ultimately own the movie, so she could just point to them and be like, well, it wasn't my fault, it was their fault. So there's a lot of ways that you can spin these failures or criticisms so that they don't land on her, if you want to. But let's talk about this notion, because one of the things I hear a lot in defense of the Kathleen Kennedy being fired argument is the board of directors wants to make money and Kathleen Kennedy's costing them money. So I think that this argument stems from this image that a lot of people have of Disney's board of directors, which isn't exactly accurate. I think a lot of people think of the board of directors as a bunch of rich white guys sitting around a boardroom, smoking cigars, drinking brandy, laughing about how great capitalism is and counting their money as they polish their monocles. That is not Disney's board, okay? just to give you an idea, Disney's board is made up of 12 people, 2 of which are Bob Iger, who's the CEO of Disney, and Alan Horn, who's Kathleen Kennedy's direct boss, and he heads up the Disney motion picture division. Now, up until recently, a big member of Disney's board was Jack Dorsey, the ultra-liberal leftist who runs Twitter. And I'm just gonna read to you guys some of the highlights of the people on Disney's board. So, excuse me with the glasses. Mark Parker is a member of Disney's board. And Mark Parker is the CEO of Nike. And he's the guy that came up with the Force is Female ad campaign. And he's the guy who hired Colin Kaepernick to be the face of Nike's new advertising campaign. So this guy is a big feminist leftist SJW CEO type dude. And he's a member of Disney's board. Now the second person I want to point out is a woman by the name of Susan Arnold. And she's a big deal on Disney's board of directors. And she's one of 5 women who are on Disney's board, 5 out of 12, okay? So who is Susan Arnold? Susan Arnold is the principal executive officer at the Folger Coffee Company. She's been an operating executive of the Carlyle Group, which is a big investment group. And she sits on the boards of 33 different companies across 10 different industries. And I believe that she's also a very outspoken lesbian, which you can read as feminist. So this is a woman who is very powerful and very well respected in the business world. And on Disney's board, she runs 2 different committees on Disney's board. And they're very powerful committees because the first committee that she runs is the nominating committee. And the nominating committee are the people who decide, who goes where. So, she decides, this, left-leaning, powerful lesbian gets to decide, whose job gets assigned to which person. And if you think for 1 second that this woman is going to throw another woman, a very powerful and well-liked and well-respected woman, under the bus in terms of, her position, I've got a bridge to sell you. And the second one is the Corporate Governance Committee, okay? And this is the committee that kind of it's the judge and jury of behavior amongst the corporation. And so basically, they'd be the one to decide whether or not Kathleen Kennedy has misbehaved in any way that would warrant her being fired. And of course, this woman's not going to, barring Kathleen Kennedy murdering someone or making a blatantly racist comment, I don't think that they would allow the Corporate Governance Committee, any reason to get rid of Kathleen Kennedy. So that's Disney's board of directors, okay? So if you take the 5 women who in no way, shape, or form are going to turn on one of their own, in addition to Alan Horn, who is a close personal friend and has a long working relationship with Kathleen Kennedy, and the Nike CEO, that's 7 out of 12 board members in Kathleen Kennedy's corner, okay? And that's not counting Bob Iger, who I actually believe is firmly in Kathleen Kennedy's corner. So assuming that the other members of the board don't support Kathleen Kennedy, she already has the majority of them and one who runs the 2 most important committees on Disney's board in her corner. Now, when it comes to the argument that the board of directors isn't going to sit still while Lucasfilm costs them money, let me explain that a little bit. You have to understand that Disney is greater than Lucasfilm, and the board of directors doesn't look at individual division profits and losses, okay? Disney is making a ton of money. They're the biggest entertainment business on the planet. Their business covers TV, movies, publishing, merchandise, theme parks, and a host of other things I'm sure I'm leaving out. So when you say Disney's losing money on Lucasfilm, it's a lie. Because even if Lucasfilm underperforms, they can make up that underperformance from other divisions. To give you an example of what I'm talking about here, when Disney bought Lucasfilm Limited back in 2012, when they spent $4.2 billion to purchase it from George Lucas. Disney stock was at roughly $50 a share. Okay? Today, after all of Kathleen Kennedy's mismanagement, Disney stock is upwards of $120 to $140 a share, somewhere in that range. Now that's over 100% increase in stock price over the course of, 6 years? All of which Kathleen Kennedy has been, in charge of Lucasfilm. So the idea that the board thinks that she's costing them money is ludicrous, because their stock price has done nothing but go up since she's been with the company. And they look at the overall health of the company, not just these single divisions like Marvel, Pixar, and Lucasfilm, because they're all part of a larger whole. Now, if Disney was as a whole losing money, then the board would start shaking things up. But because the stock price is still strong, stock price is still going up, they're still making a lot of revenue, things are pretty much going to stay the same as they are from the board of directors' point of view. Now, this also goes towards shareholders being upset with Disney over the loss of money. Shareholders aren't losing money. If you bought Disney stock back when Kathleen Kennedy first came on board as the head of Lucasfilm, you would have made a $70 profit off of the price of every share you've bought by now. And so I don't think any shareholder is going to be upset over that. Now, also keep in mind that shareholders, especially majority shareholders, have a lot of say over who goes on Disney's board, because they can vote to make sure who gets on their board and who gets off of it. Who is the second biggest shareholder in Disney right now? The answer is George Lucas, because part of the $4.2 billion deal that Disney struck with him, $2.1 billion of that purchase was in Disney common stock, based off of the $50 price tag at the time. So George Lucas owns, I kid you not, 40 million shares in Disney. Okay, 40 million. He's the second biggest single shareholder behind Steve Jobs' estate, who I think he got something like, $6 billion worth of common stock when he sold Pixar. And funny enough, George Lucas was the one who sold Pixar to Steve Jobs. Okay, because Pixar originally started as an offshoot of ILM, which George Lucas owned. So technically, I guess you could say that all that stock belongs to George Lucas. But regardless, 40 million shares can be directly attributable to him. And George Lucas personally chose Kathleen Kennedy to succeed him as the head of Lucasfilm. Okay, so when you have a 40 million share stockholder who personally chose Kathleen Kennedy in her corner, and his shares have done nothing but go up in value since she's been running his former company, he's not going to back away from her. If anything, he would call up the board members themselves and make a case for her to stay in there. Now, in addition to this, you have Alan Horn, who's the head of Disney Motion Pictures Division. So he's kind of the guy who oversees Marvel, Pixar, Lucasfilm, and all of Disney's animation properties and stuff like that. He's basically the head honcho of every movie that ever gets produced by Disney. And he's had a very close personal working relationship with Kathleen Kennedy for decades, okay? He's worked with this woman for a long time. He likes her, he respects her, and, he's her direct boss now that she works at Disney. And just to give you an idea of, the connection, how strong the connection is between Alan Horn and Kathleen Kennedy, I'm going to point out that Alan Horn is very close personal friends with Steven Spielberg. And Steven Spielberg and Alan Horn are two of the most powerful men in Hollywood. Steven Spielberg, in addition to being a director, he's a super producer. He gets a lot of projects done in TV and movies. And Alan Horn, does the exact same thing, except he does it underneath the studio banner. And in, I believe it was 2012 and 2016, Alan Horn personally organized fundraisers for Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, respectively, for their presidential campaigns, alongside Steven Spielberg. Alan Horn brought Steven Spielberg in to help throw these fundraisers for these Democratic presidential candidates. And Steven Spielberg and Alan Horn were both huge supporters of Hillary Clinton, because they both are of the mindset of women being in power. And this is one of the reasons why they're so strongly in Kathleen Kennedy's corners because they have this feminist ideology of women can do no wrong. And I'm not saying it's bad that women are being supported into positions of power. I'm just saying that in Kathleen Kennedy's case, these two guys are firmly in her corner, and anyone who says otherwise doesn't know who they are. So Kathleen Kennedy has been close personal friends and a working relationship person with Steven Spielberg since almost the beginning of his career. I mean, like she's been with him on a ton of movies, and Steven Spielberg is firmly in her corner. Now, in addition to that, Kathleen Kennedy is also married to another super producer by the name of Frank Marshall. And Frank Marshall has produced a lot of movies as well, and he has a number of relationships in Hollywood, and he's really well respected. So you have a super producer in the form of her husband, Frank Marshall. You have a super producer and legendary director in the form of Steven Spielberg. And you have a super powerful studio executive in the form of Alan Horn, making up the trifecta of Kathleen Kennedy's kind of, front line of defense. All three of these guys are Kathleen Kennedy supporters, dyed-in-the-wool, diehard. Like, even if Alan Horn had doubts about her, he couldn't really make a move without pissing off Spielberg and Marshall. And he needs that relationship with Steven Spielberg because, number one, it's a political relationship. They've thrown political fundraisers together. But number two, they have a huge working relationship in Hollywood. And if you piss off Spielberg and he doesn't want to work with you, that makes things difficult. So just the political implications of firing Kathleen Kennedy are very far-reaching because she has a lot of powerful allies within Hollywood. And if Disney were to alienate those allies, they'd be really hurting in terms of their motion picture production. So I also want to point out that Kathleen Kennedy getting nominated for an honorary Oscar is also, it's not a participation award, as some people would have you think. It's actually a very clear signal from other people in the industry that they support Kathleen Kennedy. And it's kind of like a way of passively aggressively telling the higher-ups at Disney, hey, we're in Kathleen Kennedy's corner, don't mess with her, okay? So you can't really look at that Oscar award as nothing because it's a very clear signal from major players in the industry that they're on Kathleen Kennedy's side. So Kathleen Kennedy has all these connections in her corner supporting her and protecting her. The board of directors does not feel they're losing money. And Disney itself as a corporation has a very progressive system of corporate culture. Even though they're very family friendly and they're kind of conservative on the outside, on the inside they're not. I believe, let me make sure I get her name right, the current Disney Chief Financial Officer. Okay, so Disney's CFO is named Christine McCarthy, and she's another very powerful woman in Hollywood. She's basically like the second or third in charge of Disney. She's also quite the feminist, and she is in charge of something called Disney's Division of Corporate Citizenship. Now, what is corporate citizenship, you may ask? Well, it's basically a kind of governing body that basically ensures diversity and equality within the corporate structure of Disney. So it's affirmative action within the corporation itself, essentially. And they have a woman running it, of course. So the idea that Disney would ever get rid of a powerful woman in such an important and high-profile position just doesn't compute with me. Simply because, Disney has this corporate culture of championing minorities and women and, kind of promoting diversity and, all this other stuff. So there's a lot of reasons why I felt Kathleen Kennedy was safe in her position. But let's talk a little bit about some of the reports that were coming out that refutes this idea. Because, you had a lot of insiders talking about how big of trouble Kathleen Kennedy was in, how she was going to be fired and all that stuff. Again, let me just reiterate that the only thing that you could actually point to as being Kathleen Kennedy's major misstep was Solo. And keep in mind that even though Solo underperformed in the international box office, I believe it made close to $400 million worldwide, which is not good for a Star Wars movie, especially considering the fact that you need to make about $500 million just to break even on that movie. Solo ultimately is not going to cost Disney money, okay? It's eventually going to make a profit with home video, with streaming, because Disney has a lot of ways in which they can monetize their content. It's probably going to make up a lot of its shortfall in licensing and TV syndication and all this other stuff. And already you're seeing that now that it came out on video, a lot of people who missed it in the theater are checking it out. So home video sales are already strong for that. So I wouldn't be surprised that Disney eventually makes a profit out of Solo. It's not going to be a huge profit, but they will not have lost money on it. And also, Solo kind of forced Disney kind of rethink their strategy regarding Star Wars in terms of releasing these movies year to year. So like they're backing off the yearly release, and they're probably going to move to like every 2 or 3 year release, so they can, you know, kind of keep some brand integrity going there. But, you know, getting back to my other point, let's talk about some of these inside sources that have been claiming that Kathleen Kennedy is going to be fired. Now, I don't doubt the sincerity of these inside sources that have been reporting to, you know, some of these YouTubers and stuff like that. I think that these people genuinely believed that Kathleen Kennedy was going to be fired, because I think they knew her contract was coming up, but they didn't really understand a lot of the inside, you know, politics of the situation. And they probably also didn't understand the financials all that well. I think they assumed wrongly, just like a lot of other people did, that Kathleen Kennedy was costing people money and she didn't really have very good control over Lucasfilm and all this other stuff. And this notion is, you know, it's acceptable. And I think that they were just assuming that Disney would not renew her contract and they'd eventually like hire someone else to come in and take over Lucasfilm on her behalf. So I think that their hearts were in the right place, but they just got a few details wrong. Because honestly, like, Kathleen Kennedy has not done anything worth firing, at least from the Disney executive point of view. Now, a big proponent of Kathleen Kennedy getting fired was this Grace Randolph video that she did, where she reported on a source that informed her about a super secret conference call that kind of detailed the ousting of Kathleen Kennedy. And I just want to start this off by saying I like Grace Randolph. I enjoy watching her videos, but I like her more for her commentary on movies as opposed to her actual movie news, which I think has been a little bit hit or miss. But regardless, I went back and I rewatched this video because I asked about it a few times, like what I thought about her, you know, her reporting on this. And I can remember when I first saw the video months ago when she first released it, you know, I wanted it to be true. And I thought it made a lot of sense. But when I went back and rewatched it, I actually noticed something very interesting, which is that, first of all, her source, as she reports it, was from within Pinewood Studios, which is the studio lot in London where a lot of Star Wars stuff is shot. And if you're going to be reporting on the inner workings of Disney's executive board and the politics that's going on there and the decision-making that's going on there, I don't trust any source that's outside of Disney Studios in Burbank, because that's where all the high-level decisions are made at the Disney lot in Burbank, California. So if you hear a source from Pinewood Studios, which is halfway around the world, or even if you just hear a source from inside Lucasfilm, which is located in San Francisco, very far away from, you know, the Disney lot, what you're doing is you're getting information of local rumors that don't necessarily translate to what's actually going on behind the scenes at, you know, Disney proper, which is in Burbank. So I'd be very suspicious of any inside info that comes from anywhere other than the Disney lot. Okay, so if Grace Randolph said I got a, you know, tip from someone who's in the executive offices over at Disney Studios in Burbank, I think that this would have been a much more credible story. But all that aside, she reports that her source comes from Pinewood Studios in London. And if you look at her video, the only thing that she reports as being attributable to her source is that a conference call happened, and that conference call was behind closed doors guarded by security guards. Grace never says that her source was in on the call, never says that they listened in on anything that was said on the call, or anything like that. She just says that Star Wars top brass had a secret conference call with Disney CEO Bob Iger, and that higher-ups from Marvel and Pixar were also on the conference call. Everything else in her video seems to be speculation on her part based off of what she either believes to be true or what she's theorizing from other news sources to be true regarding the contents of that conference call. So the only thing that her source can legitimately say is that this conference call actually happened. Everything else in that video is just Grace kind of theorizing. And I think it's a little bit misleading because you think that the stuff that she's talking about was the stuff that was discussed on the call, when she actually never says that. She just says, this is what could be happening, but she never flat out says, like, this is what my source said happened, okay? The only thing her source told her happened was that there was a conference call. And if Kathleen Kennedy was out at Pinewood Studios overseeing the shoots of Solo or whatever at the time, it's not unusual for the CEO to have a conference call with the heads of his different departments just to see how things are going. And I mean, you need to have these conference calls to talk about, budgets for the next year, like how much money is going to be allocated to each of these divisions, scheduling for the future movies, stuff like that. In Grace's video, she says that the heads of Marvel and Pixar were just on there to listen. And that doesn't ring true to me because, first of all, these are busy people. They don't just sit in on conference calls to listen and not talk about things. And secondly, neither the CEO nor Kathleen Kennedy would want to have people online if the CEO is ripping into her, because that's not usually done, okay? So this notion that this was to discuss replacing Kathleen Kennedy, the secret conference call that Grace reported on, doesn't ring true to me. I think it was probably a just run-of-the-mill strategic call that was limited to the leadership of these different divisions of Disney. So that's my theory on it, because if you watch that video, at no point does Grace ever say this is what's discussed. She just kind of goes off on her own theories on that. I'm not saying she's wrong. This stuff could have been discussed, but to me personally, this doesn't really ring true because I don't see how this works. The other big thing that I kind of doubt about Grace's report is this notion that they can't find anyone to replace Kathleen Kennedy, so they're kind of stuck with her. No, that doesn't happen. First of all, the idea that nobody would want to take over Star Wars after the mess Kennedy has made of it is complete baloney. You would have a line going out the door of producers and other people in the studio system chomping at the bit to be a president of a major production company within Disney, okay, especially one that handles Star Wars, if only for the paycheck. Okay, Kathleen Kennedy makes a lot of money, and people would want to make a lot of money running that thing, and if it's really that bad, they can't make it any worse, so what is there to lose, right? So this notion that they can't find anyone to replace her, I don't buy it. Also, the way that this would normally work with the studio system is that Bob Iger, if he really wanted to fire Kathleen Kennedy, okay, he'd go ahead and fire her, and then he would just promote someone from within Disney to run it in the interim while he searched for a suitable replacement for her. And the reason for this is that when studio executives do get fired, there's no lead up to it, okay? Like, they don't go around and start approaching people about replacing this executive before they're fired, because word gets around, especially someone with the connections that Kathleen Kennedy has, because if word got back to her that Iger was setting the stage for her replacement, she could either make moves to protect her position by going to members of the board or going around Iger's head, or going to Steven Spielberg and her husband and putting pressure on Iger, or she could do stuff to sabotage things before she gets thrown out. And this is not unheard of in Hollywood. A lot of, she could have tanked a number of things, or she could have stolen talent to come with her. She could have contacted all the people under contract for Star Wars films, like Daisy Ridley or whatever, and say, hey, stand with me, don't agree to do any more Star Wars movies unless they keep me on board, stuff like that. That's not out of the realm of possibility, okay? So studio heads who are firing executives underneath them, they never telegraph that they're going to be fired. So the idea that Iger approached J.J. Abrams or anyone else about taking over for Kathleen Kennedy before he fired her does not ring true to me, because that's not how it's done, okay? Basically, when the hammer drops, they want it to be a surprise. They don't want to give the executive any time to prepare for the firing, and they want to get them out of their position as quick as possible so they can find someone new to bring in and right the ship. So in my experience, what Grace reported on is just not the way executives are replaced in Hollywood. So I don't buy that for a minute. So I think that there's a lot of misinformation out here about how Hollywood operates and the position Kathleen Kennedy's in. Even if she has a number of people in Lucasfilm who are loyal to her, the new person who comes in would just fire those people. Like if they expressed any loyalty to anyone other than them, then they'd just be gone. Like he has no problem firing, you know. You come in and you clean house, okay? There's nothing that would stop a new president from firing anyone they wanted underneath them. So this idea that Kathleen Kennedy's entrenched because she has all of her people in Lucasfilm doesn't ring true to me either. So that's another big reason why I believed Kathleen Kennedy was safe in her position. So another argument that I've heard is about Kathleen Kennedy. Okay, her contract got renewed, she's staying in power, but she doesn't really have any real power. She's just kind of a figurehead. She's neutered. Other people are running the show at Lucasfilm. She's just kind of there. She can't make any real decisions. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that's just not true. Kathleen Kennedy runs Lucasfilm. She is the president, okay? She controls what projects get greenlit, and she controls what projects get money and how money is allocated within the company. The notion that she would be usurped by an underling somehow is ludicrous. It doesn't happen, okay? Now, I think that a lot of this rumor has been fed by the situation that happened over at Marvel, where Kevin Feige went over the head of Marvel CEO Ike Perlmutter right to Bob Iger and basically got emancipated from Marvel. And for those of you who don't know this story, basically Ike Perlmutter was the CEO, or is the CEO of Marvel, and he's a notorious cheapskate, and he runs all the publishing stuff out of New York. And around the time that Captain America Civil War came out, Kevin Feige had been butting heads with Ike Perlmutter over, you know, budgeting and money and all this other stuff for a very long time. And it finally came to a head with Captain America Civil War, and it caused Kevin Feige to go straight to Bob Iger and say, look, you either need to, you know, give me control of these movies or I quit. And so Bob Iger, realizing the talent that they had with Kevin Feige, basically made the decision to kind of separate Marvel Studios from Marvel itself and put it into its own like division of Disney and give control over that to Kevin Feige. So, you know, Marvel itself within Disney doesn't have any control over Marvel Studios now. And that was because Kevin Feige made a power play and went over the CEO's head to go right to the big boss. And it just so happened his gambit worked out and the big boss backed him, and now, you know, he's running his own studio. That's not the same situation here with Lucasfilm, okay? So the closest I could think of to a situation like this happening is Dave Filoni or Jon Favreau or some other big creative within Lucasfilm going to Alan Horn and saying, hey, Kathleen Kennedy doesn't know what she's doing. You know, you need to let me run the show. And if that were to happen, okay, that's really the only scenario I could see where the whole Kathleen Kennedy as a figurehead theory could actually come into play. But there's no way that either Alan Horn or Bob Iger are going to back someone over Kathleen Kennedy because they have a close personal relationship with her, and she's a very experienced producer, and she hasn't lost any money other than Solo, and even that's not a huge loss. So if there were actually any real problems at Lucasfilm, like even if that were to happen, that type of scenario that I just described, it is very, very unlikely that the person who they would go to above Kathleen Kennedy would approve of this type of gambit. And chances are that person who went over Kathleen Kennedy's head in the first place would probably be the one to be let go. Because, I mean, it really just comes down to the fact that Kennedy's insulated. She's got a lot of powerful players in her corner. And so the idea that, you know, she doesn't have control over her own division is just, it's not real. It's not a factor. Do not doubt Kathleen Kennedy has complete control over Lucasfilm. And if anyone tried to go over her head or run the show without her consent, she'd fire them. You know, like she's used to being a boss. She knows how to, you know, run things. She's been running movie productions for years. She's fired people before. she's not going to be shy to fire people to protect her position. So if there were any like inner workings to try to, usurp her authority, she'd just get rid of those people. It's that simple. So this idea that she's neutered and just a figurehead and doesn't have any creative control over at Lucasfilm is a lie. Because, the only person who could take away creative control from her would be, Alan Horn, her boss. And he would give it to someone else. And if that was the case, then, Kathleen Kennedy would just be fired and someone new put into her place. Like, why bother, doing this whole cloak and dagger type thing of giving someone else the secret control of the company? It doesn't make any sense to me. And it's not how things usually operate in Hollywood unless it's consensual. So if Kathleen Kennedy just decides, you know what, I don't want to work too hard, I don't want to make any decisions, Dave Filoni, why don't you come and you run things for me, or Rian Johnson, why don't you come over and you run things for me, and you're the one who can make all the decisions, you just report back to me, and if I have anything to say, I'll let you know about it. Because that was actually the situation with Star Trek back when I was working at the Paramount Studios lot between Rick Berman and Brandon Braga, where Rick Berman basically, he showed up at the lot maybe once a week, made a few calls, had a cup of coffee, then he left. And he was just, like, he didn't care anymore. He was just kind of enjoying having his name on all these Star Trek properties. And, I think he knew that, his days were numbered, so he was just enjoying himself. And Brandon Braga was doing all the heavy lifting. But that was consensual. Like, if Rick Berman, actually wanted to be involved, he could have been. The same is true with Kathleen Kennedy. So unless she's voluntarily promoting someone from within the company to run things for her, this whole notion of her being a figurehead and having no creative control is complete bunk, in my opinion. And another thing to touch on really quickly here is the terms of her contract renewal. So a lot of people have been pointing to the fact that she only got renewed for 3 years as being a big sign in Disney not being confident in Kathleen Kennedy's leadership ability for Lucasfilm. And to that, I say that in my research, what I found is that the typical studio executive contract at Disney is between 3 and 5 years. Okay, so it'll be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever. And the reason for that is not because Disney doesn't have faith in these people. It's because it gives both parties leeway to renegotiate. So, like, if an executive is underperforming, Disney doesn't have to wait for 10 years to get rid of them. So when their contract comes up for renewal, Disney can just choose not to renew it, and they don't have such a long term to have to wait out. And also, if the executive is performing well, the executive can renegotiate for better terms over a shorter time period. So they can, negotiate for a salary, for bonuses, for benefits, stock options, like whatever. They don't have to wait 10 years to renegotiate. They can, cash in on their success early. And I think that Kathleen Kennedy's contract with Disney has always been for a 3-year term, because if you look at it, she was signed on in 2012. And her contract was up for renewal in 2018, right? So over the span of 6 years, Kathleen Kennedy has had 2 contract renewals. The first contract renewal happened in 2015, which was right around the time that The Force Awakens hit. So for a fact that Disney re-signed her on her contract back then. But then, 3 years after that, they re-signed her again after a string of 3 hit movies that grossed a whole lot of money. So this notion that the 3-year mark is kind of like a signal that Disney doesn't have any faith in her isn't true, because her contract has always been for 3 years. And there's a renewal clause in that contract that means that the contract will probably automatically renew after 3 years if certain conditions are met. And both parties agree to the terms of the renegotiation or what have you. So this whole thing that it's only for another 3 years doesn't ring true to me, because she's probably had the same contract for the past 6 years. So don't get your hopes up on that one. Okay, so hate to be a Debbie Downer on this stuff, guys. It's just that a lot of people don't understand the inner workings of the studio system, the inner workings of Hollywood politics and all this other stuff. And I just want to kind of clear the air and explain where I'm coming from on this thing, which is that I personally believe Kathleen Kennedy is going to be in charge of Lucasfilm until at least 2030. If it falls short of that, it's because she wants to step down and she wants to move on to other things. But in that situation, she's going to choose her own successor, and so we're just going to be getting more of the same. She'll probably promote someone like Rian Johnson who we all hate because he'll carry on her legacy and, you know, whatnot. But the point of the matter is that we have to live with Kathleen Kennedy for the foreseeable future. And railing against her, just being entirely negative, is not going to affect any change in Star Wars, okay? We not only need to call her out for the bad stuff she does, but we need to recognize the good stuff that she does as well. And we need to make it clear to her that we're not toxic, we're not, you know, entirely, you know, haters and man babies and Nazis and misogynists and all these things that they accuse us of being. We need to make it clear to her that we're fans of, you know, her company, we're fans of her franchises, and we want to work with her to let her know what it is we want and help her give us what we want. So we need to be civil and we need to be intelligent about our criticisms, okay? Just going around saying Kathleen Kennedy sucks, you know, and saying that she's losing money for Disney and all this other stuff, which, you know, they don't see as true, is not going to help our cause. We need to be very clear about what our grievances are. We need to be very respectful and civil when, you know, expressing these grievances. And we also need to show that we can be positive when it is appropriate, you know? So keep in mind all this stuff going forward. In the future, when someone says they have an inside source within Lucasfilm, or like, you know, they know what's happening with Episode 9 or, you know, Kathleen Kennedy or any of the behind the scenes stuff, always take it with a grain of salt. You know, hope for the best, but expect the worst. That's kind of my philosophy on these things. And yeah, you know, and if you disagree with me, you know, feel free to let me know over on Twitter at Matthew Kadish. Love to hear from you. Just, you know, remember to be respectful, because I don't mind debate, but I don't want to be exchanging name calling and juvenile insults and stuff like that. I just want to have a discussion, and I don't care if I'm right, I don't care if I'm wrong. I just enjoy talking about this stuff, and I enjoy meeting like-minded people. And keep in mind, we're all on the same side. We all want what's best for Star Wars. We just have different ways of going about expressing this opinion. So guys, thank you so much for watching. I know I've rambled on, and I would like to thank you if you've made it to the end of this video for listening to my rambles. Feel free to leave a comment on this video and let me know what you think. If you like it, maybe I'll make more. But definitely follow me on Twitter, hit me up on Facebook, and buy my books over on Amazon. They're pretty good, or so I'm told. All right, guys, this is Matt. I'll catch you later.